Hey everybody, I'm Jay Friesen. Welcome back to Dead Reckoning. And this time we have a really awesome segment guest
This
today,
is going to be very exciting.
because I can't draw. Like, I can draw a happy face, and that's about it. And we have a professional cartoonist on the show with us today, Joshua Kemble. Joshua, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. How are you guys doing?
Oh, we're doing fantastic.
Doing pretty good.
Yeah.
So, Joshua, you have quite a list of clients. I mean, we've got Activision, Miller Lite, Clyde Snowboards, Chris Lynn, Disabled American Veterans.
Yes, impressive roster.
Merrill Lynch.
Don't read it all.
Merrill Lynch needs cartoons.
I don't know. Well, tell us about that. Tell us about your business. How are you making a living in the cartoon
what's your story?
I basically have loved comics since I was able to draw, and so I went to Cal State Long Beach to get my degree in illustration, and ended up because of the fact that was the closest to a cartooning school at the time that I had heard of in California. And then, of course, the Center for Cartoon Studies opened years later. But since then, since I basically was like a junior and an undergrad, I have worked professionally as a freelance illustrator and cartoonist for about, 8 years now. So, I mean, a lot of that just consists of doing t-shirt designs and skateboard graphics. Pretty much anything that needs art, I can provide it. And I've been fortunate enough through years of being at it to sort of add up that client list.
Yeah.
But mixed in with that client list, just so it doesn't sound too glamorous, is a lot of just mom and pop stores, like startups, so it's very akin to freelance anything or contracting. I always view what I do as I'm a sort of a plumber, but I can draw.
I love it. Well, okay, so but before we're going to delve into the real meat of why we're having Joshua on the show in a second, but for our viewers, they can go to your website, which is what, joshuakemble.com, I believe? Mm-hmm. Go there and you can go to the store, and he has all kinds of really rad merchandise. We were salivating over it yesterday.
Yeah, there's the iPhone covers,
we got
the book covers,
iPad skins for the back, and with Joshua's illustrations on it. So definitely
I almost bought a hoodie,
out.
but I didn't find a particular hoodie design I liked, so I was I should have him come up with one for custom.
So anyway, so do go check out joshuakemble.com. But Joshua, so you've had quite an interesting journey in your life. I understand that that you grew up in a Christian home, and for a long time kind of wandered away from that, and somehow the Lord has brought you back, and you are now you're engaged in kind of an interesting genre, autobiographical nonfiction graphic novel. Okay. So you're telling your life story in a graphic novel form. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how things are. What is it about your story that you think is going to be compelling for people?
Okay, well, I mean, for, like you were saying, I grew up in the church. This was very much like the 80s Republicanized version of a church. And my family didn't fit with that sort of, I guess the best way I could explain it is the sort of Petra Christians.
Okay.
The 1980s. Sort of a...
that was totally me, by the way.
Yeah. Petra Christian. Yeah. Wow.
Well, and I have no criticisms of that, except that the God that at least the Christian schools that I went to sort of taught about was much more of a God of laws and rules, and not so much a God of forgiveness and grace. And so it became much more like what I would view as a Pharisaical type of belief, at least what I got out of it. I don't doubt that there were genuine believers at the time, including in my own household, right? But I sort of, the God that I believed in growing up wasn't the God that I believe in now, which is very strange to sort of explain. But the God I believed in was much more of this sort of prosperity gospel God. And so when things weren't so prosperous and I was being faithful, I sort of was like, well, I mean, I'm putting two and two together. I'm learning more and more about evolution and about just how impossible that would be to actually live up to this law. And so I sort of abandoned that faith. And meanwhile, I had lost like my father, so I think a lot of it hinged on that too, sort of a disappointment in reality, a disappointment that during prayer, somebody couldn't be healed, and meanwhile, my career was getting blossoming, and I've always been fascinated with independent comic books, and so I always had this sort of desire to do books much like akin to what Robert Crumb was doing and Art Spiegelman in the 1980s with Raw, where it, like you said, it's autobiographical cartooning. And so I started this tirade against what I viewed as a tirade against Christianity in my first graphic novel, and just talked about losing my faith and sort of brought up some hard theological questions I was going through at the time, which was, like the main one was like, why would God make man in the first place? If you're a perfect being existing, why would you need to make man?
Sure,
and
right.
so it was like, and then just talking about sort of losing faith, and ironically, the ending was very unfulfilled. But something strange happened when I moved to Portland, Oregon, and this is sort of why I'm getting into the autobiographical, like the narrative about my own life isn't just to toot my own horn, it's actually the content that I'm going to be writing about now. This strange thing happened. I mean, I was head deep in atheism. I completely bought into it. I still am kind of a fan, although I wish he would have turned to our side, but Christopher Hitchens,
Sure.
Richard Dawkins, and I very much bought into that. And then I had this really good friend who had lent me, I mean, keep in mind, much like most salvation stories, this didn't, happen with just one person talking. It was, members of my family occasionally being patient and loving enough to have a discussion without getting angry.
Right.
And just, but a friend of mine lent me The Language of God by Francis Collins, which sort of brought up the fact that all of these new atheists were only arguing for evolution and then criticizing the Judeo-Christian God, like in much more philosophical terms, not scientific terms.
Right.
Just because they didn't like how he behaved. And so that sort of thing got me to sort of challenge, and meanwhile, all these things were going on in my life where these perfect plans that I had set up, I had this whole theory about artists being simulating God because of the lack of order and control in our own lives. Because there is a lack of order, we seek to create things so we can, make this illusion that we want of God's. And at some point, all of my own plans and my own personal plans sort of fell apart because the woman I was living with at the time sort of left, and I was living in Portland at the time, moved to another state, and so I was left with, at the time, without a license, without any friends, and sort of stuck in isolation on the outskirts of Portland, and just delved into like heavy drinking, suicidal thoughts, and my philosophy, I was finding, just had hit kind of a dead end where I couldn't justify existing. And so that was sort of the lowest point of my life, and ironically, that wasn't when I came to God. That was actually sort of the grounding, the groundwork to sort of see, I guess, how where my philosophy, where existentialism, where atheism for me had led, which was philosophically it just didn't really justify existing. And for me personally, I really didn't see a reason to exist. And ironically, like when everything kind of got patched up with my fiance who had moved away, who's now my wife, oddly enough.
Oh, wow.
But when I had moved to California and sort of patched up all of these things and problems, I thought this strange thing, which was like, why is everything not, like, why am I not fulfilled? Like, everything's going great, these problems that existed, I was at the lowest point of my life, and yet now everything's great and perfect and fine, and all of these things that I've desired are happening, and yet I still feel like I can't justify existing. I still feel suicidal. Like this was at the time, and so that was kind of the point where I sort of came to God. And I mean, there's a lot more complexity to it.
Sure.
But it seemed like really good material to mine, since I think I was saved simply by faith and by the Holy Spirit, because I still to this day can't completely rationally explain Christianity to someone who thought like I did. There are things that still kind of sound a little nuts about it, and when I'm saying them to people, when I'm witnessing, I still feel like I totally can put myself in your shoes and understand how it sounds strange to say that a God sent himself to, forgive us from our sins. But I also started thinking about just philosophically, like another thing that helped was just to think philosophically about what that world would look like if we had been made for a creator and we had fallen away and we're constantly trying to sort of replace him with things. And it felt like this reality is very much what that would look like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I guess where I'm heading is when I went back to graduate school, because of my belief in God, I was praying a lot about what I wanted to do with my life. And I felt like God was really leading me to teach. And so I wanted to teach, and I had, prior to that, dropped out of graduate school. And so I had decided I'm going to finish graduate school, and I feel like I could be a real witness within the school system at art colleges, because it's an area lacking a lot of Christian thinkers. A lot of Christians don't go and get their MFAs. And mind you, in my life group, I have a ton of Christians in there who have their MFAs and are creative thinkers. But I felt like that was a really good place to be and be a witness. And in my graduate studies, I started really re-exploring what I had gotten into art to do in the first place, and also trying to kind of think, how could I bring my faith into art and not make stories that are disingenuous or that are sugar-coated, but speak truth and more act as a witness, but in ways unlike the tracts that I used to, get when I was a kid, or that, Christians used to knock on my door and leave. I felt like I wanted to tell a story that was like, first and foremost, the focus would be to try to kind of tell a story that's as interesting as any graphic novel that I've always enjoyed, and could hold up, like by a regular publisher.
Right.
And then hopefully talk about this sort of journey, partially not just as a Christian, but as an artist. It seemed like really good material to mine for the self-exploring
right.
autobiographical genre, right?
Well, no, you certainly are. Let's talk a little bit about that. Your graphic novel. You mentioned authenticity. Not having something that's sort of sugar coated. Your it's called Two Stories, right? Is that
Quarterly Stories, right?
Quarterlystories.com.
Quarterlystories.com. That's where we can find it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know it's confusing. The website's called Quarterly Stories. That's where I'll be syndicating, each page as I create it.
Right.
And it'll be collected in a bunch of stories that will consist of 2 short stories.
Gotcha.
Right. And so you've got 30 pages, I think, are up now that people can view. Right off the bat, page 1, let's talk about Two Stories, okay? Page 1, very, very dark. Very visceral, wonderful. I mean, the artwork is fantastic, but here you are sitting there doing internet searches on how to kill yourself painlessly. And that chapter was just riveting. I found it riveting with the authenticity of this is what sin and depravity really look like. What's the place of in terms of your art? What's the rationale behind that sort of? I mean, this is not a comic book for kids, obvious. But you really display and portray depravity very strongly. Give me a little bit of your thinking behind that.
Well, part of my thinking is that initially some of the things I was sort of touching on it earlier about the church that I grew up in, a lot of what I saw in Christian art was sort of sugar-coated versions of reality. People who didn't use language, people who, wore the right clothes, romance novels where there was no temptation, these sort of candy-coated realities where, or music where it was, sad parody of music that existed, like, I'm gonna not be able to remember who quoted this, but almost like pretty much like U2 just recycled over and over again.
Sure.
And what so when I approach this, like my interest as a reader has always been in truth, and I think that as a Christian, my interest in truth has actually increased. I've always been a bit of a skeptic, and I think that's why atheism appealed to me. And I still, honestly, I love talking to atheists.
Sure.
It's actually one of my favorite things to do still, because a lot of people I know who are atheists are a lot of that is healthy skepticism, and I think they might make a lot of mistakes by thinking that Christians aren't necessarily skeptics, mm-hmm. because there's quite a lot of Christians who approach the world in a thoughtful, truth-seeking, skeptical viewpoint. So for me, it's like I wanted to sort of lay myself bare as a writer, because I feel like it gets more to the authenticity of what reality is actually like. Because in order to get into a discussion about sort of faith and redemption, I think it's important to show what reality actually looked like for me prior to salvation.
Sure.
I also think it's important to address suicide for other reasons too, because I feel like it's an issue that even Christians I know have had struggles with and have had suicidal thoughts. And I feel like the sort of almost like treating it as though it's the plague, or treating it as though it's this other, or that it's this thing that we're frightened to talk about, can actually alienate people who might have those thoughts.